Today we're going to look at the evolution of the ideal body form, something that we see in art all the time. And of course, when we think of body image issues, we think of this as a new idea, something that we blame on social media, the need to perfect the human form. But of course, we've been depicting ourselves since time immemorial, and in doing so, frequently find ourselves improving our faults, adjusting with an eye towards the ideal. Images of ourselves, memorializing for generations our search for what is ultimately Plato's ideal. This idea that something that exists in the world of ideas cannot exist in the real world. You might have an image in your head of the perfect dog, the perfect significant other, the perfect horse, whatever it is. But you can never have it in reality because reality simply cannot reflect perfectly that world of ideas, that sort of Platonic idea of the world of ideas. And yet that's what we pursue, and that's what we see in art. You see, in real life, you can't have the perfect horse, but in art, you can create the perfect horse. You can create new ideas that give you a concept of a perfect horse. And that's what I want to look at here, the role of art in creating that ideal. So let's look at some questions I want to answer. First, what is considered the perfect form and who developed it? And this is different for men and for women. We'll pursue both of those paths. How does the ideal form change over time and why? Because it does. Now, for the male form, it doesn't change that much. An ideal male in ancient Egypt is pretty identical to the ideal male today. And what role does the nude play in art? Of course, we can't deal with the evolution of the ideal without dealing in some way with the nude, and we're going to see a lot of them, so I want to give you a heads up on that. My goal here is to examine how humans have seen themselves in the West by exploring the art that we leave behind. And I'm focusing on the West because it's basically the focus of this class. If we get into non-Western, then we're dealing with a number of different cultures all at the same time. It's hard to draw the same connections. But different cultures, different societies have different body ideals. And that's something to keep in mind. So let's get into theory to practice. Well, when dealing with the ideal form, we have to start with the nude and with beauty. And beauty is not a necessity for art. I should point that out early on. Not all art is, of course, beautiful. But it does give us a place to start when dealing with concepts of the ideal. Now, Plato in his Symposium makes guests assert that there are two forms of Aphrodite, the celestial and the vulgar. In more common terms, this would be pure beauty versus sexual lust. In the West, this has justified the enormous number of nude females in the arts. Artists have attempted to move the Venus from the vulgar to the celestial. And this is really common. We have this idea of what is beauty versus what is pornography, or what is art versus what is pornography, or beauty versus vulgar. We have these ideas, and it takes on a moral tone in the West. When we look at these two art pieces, one displayed at the LACMA in Los Angeles with Kanye and everyone else there, and the other one an ancient sculpture, we can look at that and we can say, well, that one is ideal, the sculpture is ideal, the other one is somehow vulgar. But those ideas are very, very old. Those are coming from Plato, those are coming from the Greeks, and probably much earlier. In fact, the purification of Venus could not have taken place had not some abstract notion of the female form been present in the Mediterranean mind from the start. So we've got these ideas that this is all very new, and my point here is to say that this isn't new. This ideal versus lustful, or the need to idealize the human form, is one that has been with us for a very long time. How long? Well, let's move back to the Venus of Willendorf. The first example of a female form that we're going to look at is the Venus of Willendorf. And this can be dated back to the Stone Age. It's an old piece. We're looking at something roughly 30,000 years old. So someone 30,000 years ago carved this out of limestone. It's painted red with red ochre, basically rust mixed with water. And the origin of the nude in art, as we now understand it, was only revealed about 100 years ago in the Austrian town of Willendorf, where this curious female form would be uncovered. Now, she's from the Paleolithic, so she's at least 25,000 years old. There's no facial details, but what we notice are voluptuous breasts, which her hands point to and rest upon. And in fact, her arms seem to be resting upon the top as well. And we see this distended stomach that could show that she's pregnant. Apart from that, we don't know a lot about her. There are other figures like this. They're known as Venus figurines. They've been discovered from the Paleolithic period all over the world, but for various reasons, this piece has assumed a huge power. There's all sorts of speculation about what it may have been used for. The image of fertility, of course, is very powerful, and others have said that she's a goddess. There's also interesting speculation that it may well have been a woman, that this presents a woman's eye view of the female form, which, if it's true, is a really interesting twist on what's otherwise a male-dominated history of art. She's a mysterious object, and she comes from a time when the very story of art begins. And in some ways, the history of the nude can be traced to this simple, enigmatic, powerful, crude, but lovingly made little object. Now, the thing is she pure or lustful? Is she vulgar or celestial? Well, let's look at her. What they've done, what the artist has done, is taken the female form and more than likely accentuated certain features, accentuating the breasts, the hips, the belly, the thighs, amongst other things. Now, is this uncommon? Well, it's not today. We do it all the time. Look at Instagram, after all. But what they're doing is they're pushing these elements of fertility. Remember, in the Paleolithic, fertility is something that is a mystery. They don't know why sometimes a woman gets pregnant, but sometimes she doesn't. They don't understand that. In fact, it won't be until about the 17th century, 18th century that we really get a good grasp on that. So you could see her as somehow vulgar, but given the context, more than likely she's a fertility figure. And remember, fertility applies to crops as much as it does to people. And so that accentuation of certain figures and forms may mean that this is a fertility figure, something that might be a talisman, something that might bring fertility to someone or to their crops or a number of other circumstances. It's a really interesting piece. And it shows certain very modern ideas, those ideas of accentuating certain characteristics of the form while ignoring others, such as the face or the hands, which are simply etched in. There's a lot of mystery here. And remember, this is over 20,000 years old, so we don't have a lot of context. But over the next 20,000 years, numerous cultures will emerge, and we're going to see a lot of change in the human form and how it's depicted in art. So of course we have to deal with the Greeks. Now, we see the Greeks as the foundational civilization for Western thought, and of course they had their own ideas of the perfected form over 2,000 years before our current time. Now, Thucydides talked of nudity as a mark of progress that distinguished the modern from the old-fashioned, the Greek from the barbarian. And this is going to be crucially important. For us in the modern day, nudity is often only acceptable in art, though discouraged in society at large. In Greece, male nudity was acceptable at the gym, at athletic meetings, and at the baths and so on. And let me point out, this is male nudity. We haven't gotten to female nudity yet. And therefore, its portrayal is a reflection of a society rather than of eroticism. The Greek city-states were militaristic societies, despite their arts and sciences. And it was on warfare that their success depended. Soldiers and their physical prowess is going to be key. This also serves as propaganda, showing the strength of our own soldiers to our own people, but also to our potential enemies. Statues glorified that male militaristic strength and put it on a pedestal. We can see that even more clearly with the spear bearer. And this is one of the most famous of the Greek statues, this spear bearer. This, of course, being a Roman copy of the Greek original. To make beautiful, to glorify a healthy body of a fit young man, that's really the key to the spear bearer. The great philosopher Socrates himself, trained as a sculptor, said that artists should represent the workings of the soul by accurately observing how feelings affect the body in action. Such statues were then placed in public arenas, such as gymnasia, where the male clients worked out with their dumbbells and could give in awe and could live in awe of these representations, perhaps feeling a little bit inferior. And I think possibly the men looking at those images may well have felt slightly insecure about their kind of ever-growing midriff, post-age of 30 or whatever the situation might be. Imagine looking around the baths and the gymnasium, and these are the figures that you're seeing. It's not really an inclusive environment or a non-judgment zone as we might see today. This is judgment in action, and for the Greeks, in part it serves as propaganda. Again, encouraging the men to strengthen themselves to hit a certain ideal so that they can serve better in war. But at the same time, it gets across a certain body ideal. Now, they may have been inspired to get back into the gym or maybe back to the running track, because obviously for that culture, they were idealized body forms, and anyone looking at them would probably have compared their own body to those ideals. The rise of the classical nude in the 5th century BC brings together a number of elements. First, it's about the rising self-confidence of the Athenians that have just defeated the Persians. They've done this spectacular thing. They were the underdog, and they were victorious. Secondly, it's also about that military force, and it's certainly true that the musculature and the modeling of the figures in the 5th century recall armor, recall the military youths that had won that victory. I think there's a very strong way in which the Greek nudes of the classical period represent a form of what we might call body fascism, in the sense that they represented the ideal form of a human being. And that's very strong in a culture which conceives of its gods also taking on human form. So that this form of a man also carries with it the print of a god. For the Greeks, a beautiful body was considered direct evidence of a beautiful mind. The form of male beauty is still with us today, informing male fitness and adorning the covers of fitness magazines the world around. And this body type that we see in celebrities today is closely related to exactly what we see from the Greeks. And the Greeks are getting that ideal from the Egyptians, who are getting it from the ancient Near East. This is an old ideal. The male body form doesn't change that much. Yes, we may decide that we want the male form to be a little more muscular or a little less muscular, but ultimately a lean body with broad shoulders and a narrow waist is what we look for in the male form. But this brings us to a point, this idea of proportion and the rise of Canon. Now, as an artistic concept, the ideal is based on the belief that sculptors and painters might transcend everyday appearance by idealizing their subjects, so trying to depict physical perfection. Now, you would think that you could just select the best models and eliminate all of the apparent flaws, but this doesn't actually happen. In fact, you have to look at proportion and focus on those ideas of proportion, not only in the face, but in the body overall. We see this idea arise from 5th century Greece, 5th century BC Greece. The artists of that period sought to create human forms that embodied their notions of beauty, sexuality, and social conditioning, while investing the form with certain moral qualities. Remember, the perfect human form means that they have the perfect human soul and the perfect mind. Unfortunately, one quickly finds that the ideal does not come from pulling together the most perfect parts. Instead, you need to focus on those proportional relationships, which were and are of fundamental importance, especially in sculpture. Polycleitus, when he creates his spear bear, wrote a treatise on the subject that stated that the beauty or perfection of a figure, quote, arises from the commensurability or symmetry of its constituent elements, and from the relationship of finger to finger, and of finger to palm and wrist, and in fact of everything to everything else. So it's not about finding the most perfect nose, the most perfect lips, and putting them together. That's how you get Frankenstein. Everything's out of proportion. We've all done that, right? In grade school, at some point, you took a magazine, you cut it apart, and you took the perfect eyes and the perfect hair and you put it together, and it looks monstrous, doesn't it? Because it's not proportional. They're all from different forms. So Polycleitus is saying it's not about the shape, it's about the proportion that is going to be the key to the ideal form. And by the way, we still follow that idea today. The idealized statues modeled and carved in ancient Greece, copied in the Roman Empire, and rediscovered in the 14th and 15th century in Italy, became part of the Western artistic canon. Now, I should point out a canon, in the art historical sense, is the acceptable body of supposedly major works of art that represent the supposed arc of art through time. The Greeks thus established a criterion for human beauty that has conditioned the attitude of the West ever since, and has often been used to divide images between the celestial and the vulgar. We look back at the Greeks, and for so many things we look back at the Greeks. We look back at them for democracy, for philosophy, for theater. It's not surprising that we look back at them and basically say that they create that dividing line between what is art and what is erotic, what is acceptable and what is not, or for our purposes, what is celestial, what is pure, and what is vulgar or lustful. But why are these characteristics beautiful? Well, for the answer to that, we need to look at evolution. After all, evolution plays a large role, or at least can serve as a starting point for determining what is ideal. One of the most famous studies of physical attraction involved hip-to-waist ratio. According to the study, healthy premenopausal women will have a waist 0.67 to 0.8 of their hips. In other words, 0.67 of the size of their hips to 0.8 the size of their hips. This shape is considered feminine and attractive to Pleistocene men. Basically, at a very basic level in the back of our brain, men tend to find this form attractive. And there's good evidence that this ratio is adaptive, since women with a good hip-to-waist ratio are significantly more fertile. We see this ratio from Botticelli's Birth of Venus to modern nudes of today. Not to leave out the men, women seem to prefer men with wide shoulders, muscular upper bodies, including pectoral muscles and biceps. Nicely configured muscles over a relative absence of abdominal fat is a significant feature in defining a beautiful man. From an evolutionary perspective, this means that muscular men are more likely to keep a Pleistocene woman fed and secure from the very real dangers of the prehistoric world. Both of these standards relate to the ability to pass down genes and protect the resulting child. Today, many argue against these body standards, but they appear to be ingrained in our DNA over the last 80,000 or so generations of our Pleistocene ancestors. They also inform our ideals of beauty. At this point, you may be thinking, but what about the changing standards of female beauty over time? Well, good point. For that, we need to return to the Greeks. You see, we have these ideas of female beauty, and we think of them changing over time, and they do to some extent. While we've examined female sculptures such as the Venus of Willendorf, we should start with one of the early female nudes of Greece, the Aphrodite of Knidos. Now, female nudity had a moral and religious problem in the 5th century BC in Greece. Women and goddesses were rarely, if ever, shown nude until the 4th century BC. In fact, it's going to be a couple of hundred years between our first male nudes in Greece and our first female nudes. And this is reputedly going to be the first full-length female nude, the one that we'll look at, the Aphrodite of Knidos. But before we get there, let me point something out. The reason that we see male nudes so much earlier than female nudes is their role in Greek society. And by Greek, I mean, well, Athenian. Women were meant to breed. And in fact, it was tabloid news when a Greek general, an Athenian general, actually fell in love with his wife. That wasn't what was supposed to happen. You married so that you could have heirs and offspring, and then you had other significant others for more lustful needs. So that's going to be important because women take on this very different role. They are to be sheltered. They aren't to be spoken to. They aren't the people in power in Athens. They are shoved off to the side in the house. They are a necessity to continue the society, but they aren't important in society. It's a male-dominated society. So we see a lot of male nudes and a lot earlier than we see female nudes. They also have these ideas of modesty that apply to the female form that don't apply to the male form. But let's get on to the Aphrodite of Knidos. The Aphrodite of Knidos is one of the first female nudes that we see coming out of ancient Greece. It shows the goddess Aphrodite and was intended for religious purposes. In fact, that's probably why this is the first nude, because the goddess Aphrodite is, for the Greeks, a fertility goddess more than anything else. And therefore, the depiction of the nude tied to fertility makes a lot more sense. But when it is presented to the people of the island of Kos, they refuse it because she was fully nude and this was deemed to be immoral. Therefore, she ends up on the island of Knidos. Attitudes for the female nude were clearly different to those of the male. In fact, Greek societies held that the female nude was the male nude incomplete and therefore inferior. But this is the beginning of a kind of eroticism that we can now recognize. This is a highly idealized view of beauty and a highly controlled and submissive image of female sexuality. First, she's visible in the round. So she's visible from all angles. The other reason for the fame or celebrity of the sculpture is going to be because of the artist who produces it. A man by the name of Praxiteles, an Athenian by birth, who in some ways was the father of classical and modern sculpture. But in the end, we're left with an idealized view of beauty. Somewhat idealized. Now, are they applying the same proportions? Is Praxiteles applying the same proportions to the Aphrodite of Knidos that we would see in a male sculpture such as the spear bearer? And the answer is no, he's not. And in fact, when we look at this female nude, you'll notice that the men we tend to see in heroic positions, we tend to see warriors, gods, athletes. And here we see Aphrodite getting out of the bath. It gives us a lot to think about when it comes to women in Greek society, something that I get into in a different video. Here, what he's done is he's created the female form, but he's altered it. This is a female that is, to him, pure, focusing on the ideals of fertility. But it's not quite what we would expect when you're looking at sculptors in the ancient Greek world who are using proportion on the male form all over the place, adding muscles and everything else that don't exist. But this is one step in the direction of the Greeks. We also have to deal with the Venus de Milo. Now, here we have a sculpture that has held her place in popular imagery as a symbol or trademark of beauty. She is seen as, of all the pieces of antiquity, one of the most complex and the most artful. When it comes to idealizing the form, just as with Polycletus, we can see a canon of proportion in full view. They're starting to apply those ideals of the male form to the female form, and we're seeing that in the Venus de Milo far more than we're seeing that in the Aphrodite of Knidos. But of course, we're also about 300 years further along. There's a sense of a live, sensual body emerging out of the form, even though the face is rather formulaic in the way that it's produced, as a lot of Greek art was. So what we're seeing is the idealization, thus the eroticization, of the female nude. For the first time in history, the nude is becoming more openly and deliberately sexual. This is accentuated by the painting that would have been applied to most of these statues. Almost none of the Greek statues, or the Roman statues for that matter, were left white. They were actually painted. Notably, the faces, where we see as white marble today, were probably boldly colored, with eyes tinted blue and lips made red. The planes of her body, what attracts people to this form and what draws us to this composition, is that the planes of her body are so large and calm that we barely perceive the subtle but important S-curve of her body form. Thus, the Venus de Milo has remained one of the most splendid physical ideals of humanity to many an art historian. So the Venus de Milo is where we start moving into the world of the ideal, and out of the world of simply depicting the female nude, but now we're going to idealize that female nude. You'll also recognize from the Venus de Milo a body form that in most societies would pass as ideal. She might be a little bit off from one society to another, but not by much. She wouldn't be far outside of the norms, as it were. So we're seeing that ideal of the form coming out of the Greeks, not only in the male form, but also, and by the way, very, very late in Greek society, in the female form. So how do we get from ancient Greece to modern day? Well, the Greek Empire, of course, will wane, and it will be replaced by the power of the emerging Roman Empire. But the idea of Greek art, and the nude in particular, doesn't diminish. In fact, the Romans were totally enthralled by the Greek ideal nude and made slavish copies of it. And it's interesting because the Romans will simply copy a lot of the Greek sculptures. In fact, many of the surviving sculptures that we study today of Greece are Roman copies. In fact, they took with them Greek nudes to put in public places. They're doing this just like the Greeks would have, in public baths and markets and everywhere else. This would have surrounded you if you were an ancient Roman. They wanted to exploit both images of male strength, but also female eroticism, and the Romans will eroticize the female form far more than the Greeks ever would. Of course, these Roman copies, as well as a few surviving Greek originals, will reappear, giving rise to the cultural explosion known as the Renaissance. These sculptures are going to turn up, especially in Pompeii in southern Greece, or southern Italy, and they're going to turn up all over the place. And when they do, it gives the Renaissance a bit of a kickstart, a bit of an idea of what the nude should be. And these sculptors and artists look at these Greek forms as inspiration. And so we're going to see that in the Renaissance. Now, female bodies in the Renaissance take on slightly different forms. In the Renaissance, we come across a peculiar problem with the female form, which is that artists could not use female models for fear of what is known as sins of the mind. Men sin with their body, sin with their mind. Women sin by existing. At least that's the belief in the church at the time. So that's a problem. Consequently, what's going to happen is you're going to get awkward sculptures like this, and the result is that artists will use the male form as a model, then alter it to fit the female character. And this can be very problematic. So what you see oftentimes is a young man, maybe 14, 15, a young assistant, maybe prepubescent as well, being used to model the female form, and then elements of quote-unquote femininity added to it. So when you look at a Renaissance female nude, you're not generally looking at a female nude. You're looking at a male nude that's been transitioned. Which brings us to the birth of Venus. So this is very famous. This is Botticelli's Birth of Venus, and what we see is an image of the goddess emerging from the sea. She's being blown gently to shore by two winged gods who scatter petals and roses around her. And she's just about to be greeted by another figure on shore, the goddess of spring known as Primavera, who holds a cloak for her. The Venus herself isn't actually classical, but almost Gothic, with slender proportions and a certain imbalance in her pose, with her body set far to the right of her weight-bearing foot. And in fact, this would never happen in classical sculpture. What do I mean? Well, when you look at the lines that I've drawn, in a classical sculpture such as the Venus de Milo, the center of balance, I'm taking the center of form at the navel, comes down between the feet. We know that she can stand in that pose because it falls at the proper spot. Whereas if you try to stand with your navel far off to the right of where your feet are, well, you're going to fall over. Botticelli is looking at Gothic sculpture, such as these pieces, as well as the classical, trying to draw them together to create what to him is the perfect female nude. And again, it's probably not a female, and it takes on a number of different elements. Despite the lyricism of her form, we find ourselves not before the idealized Venus de Milo, but rather more before, well, the Aphrodite of Knidos. We don't see a lot of idealization in Botticelli's form. After all, look at the shoulders slumped down. The form is soft, but it gives the impression of fertility. This is, after all, a goddess of fertility through human sexuality. The female body has returned to a certain pragmatism, not something ideal so much as a useful object for the purpose of reproduction, and this is really common in the Renaissance. Then again, this may be the ideal. Perhaps those two ideas are too tightly interwound to determine their individual bounds. Perhaps the spectrum between purity and vulgarity is simply too cloudy and too gray for us to place any one piece in one category. So from there, we move into the modern. Of course, the female form and its ideal characteristics will change through societies. Some accentuate the breasts or a small waist or larger hips and buttocks, but we do not see anything truly novel, moving too far from the standard laid down by the Greeks. After all, we do not have an example, for example, seen a desire to idealize women as bodybuilders, at least not yet. However, there has been a push over the past 50 years to redefine the idea of beauty, moving from a culturally based model to an individualistic form of subjective beauty. Really fancy way of saying, instead of society saying X is beautiful, now we're moving to an individual model where each individual sets their own parameters for what is beautiful. Not surprising in the generation of the generation of the internet and everything else, where everything is really customized to us. But this brings us to an interesting painting when dealing with the ideals of the human form, which is Freud's benefit supervisor sleeping. Now, this piece is by Lucian Freud. The portrait sitter, by the name of Sue Tilley, now promoted from benefit supervisor to manager of a job center in central London, says, and I quote, "My life's changed overnight. I'm beside myself, but then lovely things are always happening to me. Still, I'm not surprised. In a way, I always thought that this might happen. I love that painting." Which is an odd thing to hear. This is not a painting that captures ideal beauty. This is not a painting that idealizes her or her form or anything about it. But yet the effect isn't cruel in a point and gasp sort of way, like those television shock documentaries that encourage us to mock the obese. Instead, we're shown a sympathetic form with a remarkable, palatable presence, flinging back her head as though lost in ecstasy or perhaps tranquility. One of the most striking things about Freud's painting of Tilly is how much it departs from the conventional definition of female beauty. Freud, of course, was operating in the wake of modernism, which had vigorously assaulted time-honored ideals of beauty. Lucian believed that beauty was an artificial and fluid concept, constructed by different societies in different ways, but in the West, it stems from a single source. And again, that's the Greeks. This seems to bring us back inexorably to near where we started, or the Greeks. It would appear that they have not only laid out the basis for Western government, thought, and theater, but down to how we perceive ourselves. No single group in Western civilization has had a greater influence on our ideas of the ideal and body form than the Greeks over 2,000 years ago, in an age without any of the modern elements that we tend to blame for these body ideals that may be unrealistic. And let me remind you that as the Greeks do it, at least with the male form, they're adding muscles that don't exist. They're removing elements that they don't like. They're idealizing the form beyond what is human. They gave us the ideal, and as a result, body image expectations, which we have chased over time. So let's draw all of this together. Let's come to some conclusions dealing with the questions that I posed at the beginning of this presentation. I would suggest that the issue of body image stems from evolutionary adaptations, which developed in our Pleistocene ancestors to ensure the survival of the species. Art will, of course, pick up on elements of genetic lineage as it seeks the ideal and the perfect. Funny how the same characteristics sought out 80,000 generations ago reappear in your Instagram feed or on the cover of Cosmo. I would also argue that we began perfecting our image as far back as the Paleolithic, but lacked the time and resources to bring it to fruition until 5th and 4th century BCE Greece. Only then do we focus on the issue for reasons that extend beyond the depiction of gods. This leads to art as the source of the ideal body image. Remember, in Greece, these statues are nearly ubiquitous in the baths, markets, and temples. It would have had a striking impact on the population, just as seeing altered images in print and online do today, giving us the ideal, giving us something to strive for. And that's not to say that the Greeks didn't have the same body image issues that we do today. You probably saw many of the same things because they're surrounded by impossible bodies that you can't possibly get to as an ideal. But they're also the source of that ideal. They're where the evolution really starts. Now, what role does the nude play in art? Well, the human form is seen as beautiful, making it an ideal subject for art. Of course, our ideas of beauty are based entirely on our species. You're not going to find a dog particularly beautiful, not in the same sense that you find a fellow human beautiful. And so it makes sense that we're going to look at the human form. The human body can also be highly expressive. It may be used to express a full range of emotions and feelings to which the viewer can hopefully relate. The human form is part of the commonality which holds the human race together. It is familiar to all people, regardless of background, sex, education, culture, or ethnic identity. Thus, artists often use the human form in their art to express universal truths. Art is simply reflecting the desires of the time, and in the process physically depicts our own physical desires, leading to a sense of idealization. What the Greeks were doing is no different than what we are doing. They're just a lot closer to the source than we are. And when we look at that evolution of the ideal, it comes from the world of art. When you look at celebrities like these, all they're trying to do is mimic the perfection that you can only see in art, because you can't have the ideal. Remember Plato at the beginning of this. You can't have the world of ideals. You can't have that. It's not real. And the real world cannot perfectly reflect the world of ideas, but art can. Art can reflect the world of ideas because it is plastic, it is malleable, it is shapeable. And so when you look at celebrities, when you look at these people with perfect forms, remember that they're creating the same sort of art that the Greeks were 2,000 years ago.